The American government has blatantly expressed its disregard and hatred for people of color since we first touched American soil. Through slavery, the Civil War, and segregation, its latest antic to keep people of color oppressed is the nominal war on drugs. In 1971, President Nixon declared the war on drugs to help put an end to drug abuse by implementing stiffer punishments for drug dealers and drug users. The war on drugs began before my mother was born and before I was born, and has affected me my entire life because I have recovered addicts in my family, as well as people who have just been released from prison and are trying to restart their lives after being in prison for non-violent drug offenses. These are all victims of America's war on drugs. The war on drugs was a failure, and I will explain how by explaining the racial and ulterior motives of the war, the effects of the war, as well as efforts that are fighting to put an end to the failed war on drugs. To begin, we will discuss the racial and ulterior motives of the war. The war on drugs is a failure before it began because it was based on racial and ulterior motives. Richard Nixon began the war on drugs so that he could target certain demographics that went against his political agenda. The war on drugs was the opportunity for Nixon to target the anti-war left as well as black people. My opposition might say that Nixon's hand was forced to do something because, according to the Public Broadcasting Service, by the year of 1971, 15 to 20% of Vietnam soldiers had developed a heroin addiction. Nixon's hand was not forced. This all points back to the United States government. They sent these troops to fight this war in Vietnam, and they don't want to take responsibility for the mental damage that has caused these troops. It is merely a cover-up for his true intentions. John Ehrlichman, former counsel to President Nixon, states, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Instead of accepting accountability for the mental damage in these troops forced them to turn to heroin, Nixon criminalizes anti-war hippies to make them lose their credibility, and he just continues to scapegoat the black community. To this day, certain demographics are still being targeted by the drug war. Black people are associated with crack cocaine, Latinos are associated with marijuana, and Asians are associated with opiates. Now that you have an understanding of the racial and ulterior motives of the war, we will now discuss the effects of the war. The effects of the war on drugs prove that it has been counterproductive and that it is proved that the war has done more harm than good. Due to the war on drugs, the prison population in the United States has risen dramatically. The United States has the largest prison population in the world. According to the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics, the United States prison population was approximately 200,000 in the year of 1970. Today, it is 2.3 million. We have more prisoners than Cuba, Vietnam, and China. All countries criticized by the United States for being repressive. This is hypocritical. As a result of the war on drugs, communities of color have suffered decades of biased law enforcement and over-policing, as well as police brutality. As a result of the war on drugs, there has been an increase in criminal activities. Because there is no way for addicts to pay for their drugs or pass drug tests for jobs, they go about theft so that they can pay for their drugs. And because there is no legal way to settle disputes, people are more likely to go about murder and other violent tactics. And as a result of the war on drugs are more dangerous. People are using drugs more than ever. According to Learn Liberty, a YouTube channel founded by the Institute of Humane Studies, the quality and potency of illegal drugs is uncertain. People have no way of knowing what they're getting, and therefore drugs are more fatal. People are more likely to resort to more lethal chemicals because they're easily accessible to make their drugs. Way dangerous. My position might argue that if people want legal drugs, they're illegal drugs for a reason, and certain drugs are illegal for a reason. But drug policy reformist Ethel Naderman debunks this by stating, the reason some drugs are lethal and others not has almost nothing to do with science or health or relative risk of drugs, and almost everything to do with who uses and who's perceived to use certain drugs. What this is getting at is cocaine users are more likely to be white, and crack cocaine users are perceived to be black. There are stiffer punishments for crack cocaine users than cocaine users, although they are the same drug. The government is not concerned with the health and well-being of people. They just want to continue the failed war on drugs at the expense of the freedom of people of color. In the future, we hope to put an end to the failed war on drugs. The war on drugs is a failure, and though some of its effects are irreversible, we hope to strive for a better country. We must move drug policy away from policing and into health where it belongs. As opposed to taking a punitive approach, we must take a rehabilitative approach. Rebecca McCrae, editor for the American Civil Liberties Union, states, cravings for heroin and subsequent relapse can occur weeks and months after initial withdrawal symptoms subside, indicating that detoxification is useful only when paired with a long-term treatment plan. What happens when people gain drugs behind bars? We must rehabilitate our people so that they don't become addicted to these drugs. Also, drugs that are now criminalized must be legally regulated. This will reduce crime, violence, corruption, and allow taxpayers' dollars to go towards more useful purposes. I've given you all an overview of why the failed war on drugs must be put to an end. I have explained the effects that have thoughts that pretty much explain how we can put it to an end. And we must ensure that justice and equity is granted to everyone in the country. This is anything but the land of the free. And it won't be until we protect ourselves from public enemy number one, the American government.